Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jenny Liu. I am the instructor of record for the Friday's transportation seminar on the urban studies and planning side, and Dr. Audrey is on the civil engineering side. So for those of you who've never been in the transportation seminar before, make sure you get a copy of the syllabus that will be going around in the folder, and also to sign in if you are registered in this class for credit. And also make sure you read all of the requirements on here and contact the instructor of record to ask any questions if you have any. So today, without much, how are we doing?
Okay. And we're going to pass this around. There's going to be a syllabus inside the folder. Please mark your attendance and then take one.
All right, so I am going to turn the floor to our two very great speakers today, Dr. Aaron Golub from Portland State University School of Urban Studies and Planning, as well as Vivian Satterfield from Opal. All right, thank you.
Wow. Hi, everyone. Happy Friday. It's great to be here. I'm Vivian Satterfield. I served for 6 years as the Deputy Director at Opal Environmental Justice Oregon. As of Friday, I am now the Director of Strategic Partnerships at Verde, and we are located here in Portland, Oregon.
Hi, I'm Aaron Golub. I'm the Director of the School of Urban Studies and Planning and a researcher here in the Transportation Center, and work with Vivian on this project. I just want to start out by acknowledging kind of the funders of the project, Fourth and the National Institute for Transportation Communities funded the project with coordination through from 11th Hour Foundation and the City of Portland Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So we're going to kind of go back and forth presenting. We collaborated over the last year on this project. This is the first time we've presented it, so be a little bit
this rusty, presentation.
Yeah. At least. So Vivian, you'll start.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge that we also worked with Mike and Jay. They were really valuable help to the project, and they're now off doing amazing things in the community. You probably have interacted with them at some point. So I'll advance the slide. So we're going to start with talking a little bit about what smart mobility is. Now, as a community organizer and a community-based environmental justice organization, both Opal and Verde are, we don't use necessarily terms like smart mobility, although this is the term that we started basing our research questions off of. Our communities are more apt to use informal languages to describe how they're getting around. And so as we go through the presentation, we'll sort of unpack that because that really determined how we actually structured our research, starting with a focus group and focus group questions to really understand what sort of terminology we needed to do. It's also notable that we did a lot of interviews monolingual in Spanish, and then were translated into English for our benefit. And so there's just a lot of language to consider when we talk about it. But overall, when we talk about smart mobility, what we're talking about is what's here on this slide. The transportation services, operations, or traveler information, smart screens that we have down at the bus mall telling you arrivals, that sort of information is smart mobility. It's either fast, real-time, wireless, distributed data streams. It can also refer to autonomous, electric, connected, and shared mobility technologies. And what they almost always require from the user or traveler side is to have data and internet connectivity and direct access and link to bank or credit card accounts in order to participate in this smart mobility. So some examples that we may all be familiar with, you may even got here to this building today on, include bike share. I know that Portland State University recently expanded the bike share service for students and faculty. Ride sourcing like Uber or Lyft, transit information apps, smart transit fare payment systems like tapping on, tapping off with your phone or even with a card. What is not smart mobility? Cash. Right? Cash and trying to just wait around at the bus stop to figure out when your bus is going to come or if it's coming at all. We can think of that as not being smart mobility. And so, Portland, the city, actually submitted to ODOT a smart cities mobile application. This was a call that was put out, and Portland was among many competitor cities who submitted a competitive process to have their work be funded, focusing on the smart mobility challenges. Now, unfortunately, Portland was not competitive enough to receive any support and funding from that particular opportunity. However, the city of Portland and the PBOT, the Portland Department of Transportation, I've had a 3-week break from work, so this is all coming back to me now, has continued to pursue smart mobility. Actually, I think much in terms of just what's going on and what we're seeing now with emerging technologies and overall demand, user demand for better, faster, more creative solutions to our mobility issues, and which is why they continue to undergo this. And also being informed by a number of community needs assessments. I would say that Portland State, I know, has conducted a number of mobility needs assessments. This is only one of them, and Opal is only one of community groups who's undergone it. Verde, actually, the current organization I'm at now, is also doing a geographically based needs assessment as well. So we really had 3 primary research questions that we wanted to address. And Opal, as an advocacy-based organization, we organize a base of transit-dependent people to really inform our advocacy and outreach efforts at every single level of decision-making. So knowing that was our base and the people that we were going to be interacting with directly, these were the sort of research questions that we wanted to pursue. So as public transportation providers and agencies move to these sort of payment, information, trip planning, and what we call first and last mile connectivity systems, which actually require those end users, those travelers, to have access to private internet and banking services, this overall privatization of a public benefit. And the way that we describe transportation mobility at Opal is it's not about getting from point A to point B, it's about access to opportunity, especially in an urban environment. If you don't have the transportation systems, if they're not accessible to you, that actually limits your ability to access and interact with the built urban environment. That's really critical, and that's an environmental justice issue. So knowing there's this growing trend, right, of a privatization of public access services that relate to mobility, and who really determines who has a right to the city, again, in an urban environment, we wanted to ask, what steps can be taken to ensure that this coming wave of smart transportation innovations will benefit all groups equitably? And of course, our interest was even better, how can we achieve transportation justice? And transportation justice has been a long tenet of Opal's work. Some of the overall campaigns that we've worked on, which you may or may not be aware of, is we helped extend the transfer time on TriMet from 2 hours to 2.5 hours. Although that was directly impacted transit-dependent people who are being displaced the outer edges of our city, who have less opportunities to make connections and travel, and they needed more time, their advocacy efforts together benefit us all. Now we all get 2.5 hours. So that is a concrete way of us saying, what does transportation justice look like, and who leads and who determines that? Just want to acknowledge, like I mentioned earlier, that there is some existing research on these issues. We're not doing it for the first time. We did go deep specifically on one geographic area and with specific populations, which we'll talk about. Some of the things that we should be aware of and reference is a 2015 FDIC banking survey around access, that there's 20% unbanked and 7% unbanked. And those rates are much higher for low-income people, and POC stands for people of color. Why is that? Not having a lot of money, being low income, is a challenge, is a barrier. Fees and also trust and privacy issues are these primary causes. We'll come back to that later because that was actually very, very significant in our study in East Portland. Digital divide issues are also widely noted in a lot of existing research of smart mobility. When we talk to community members, I think a lot of us are familiar and being wary of how we use our data plans. If you're low income, if you're accessing places which don't offer free Wi-Fi, that's much more limiting. And again, referencing that work that PSU has done on equitable access to bike share. Some of these issues are coming up again and again and again. These were our 3 discrete research questions. How can smart mobility technologies address the current and future needs of transportation disadvantaged communities? And we'll define that. What are the barriers to using smart mobility technologies experienced by different communities? And more importantly for Opal, this is our big interest here, is what potential solutions show the most promise in overcoming these barriers. This is an opportunity for advocacy, and this is really where we take research and pair it with grassroots-based building and advocacy efforts in order to impact change, and delivering this information back to the people who are experiencing the injustice, the transportation injustice. So overall, who are transportation disadvantaged communities? If you're going to someone in public, they would never define themselves as this. No one says, oh yeah, that's me, I'm definitely transportation disadvantaged. But if you are low income, if you belong to a community of color, if you are mobility challenged, whether that's because of a visual impairment or other sort of mobility issue, you're mobility challenged. Age, we do restrict access to certain mobility based on age, and English proficiency. So for the purposes of our research, we really wanted to focus on East Portland, and we'll show some demographic maps in order to say why we picked that geographic area here, and really wanted to hone in on low-income communities and communities of color. That is primarily what Opal's base is comprised of. We intentionally go out and target these communities for advocacy efforts, our base building efforts, our political and popular education efforts, in order to the end of building power in these communities to be self-determinative, to speak for themselves and be able to say, these are the sort of things that we would like to see in our communities. So it's more of a bottom-up approach of advocacy and not a top-down, nor just solely research-informed. This is a map of our metro region. So you'll see some of the other jurisdictions that butt up against Portland here. What's important to note is the darker shade indicates that there is a higher concentration of people of color or limited English proficiency and low income. So the very darkest parts of the map show where there's that overlapping concentration of those three groups. And so you can see it's pretty stark that we have a lot of darkness on the outside, and then a lack of that in the inside. And these are trends that, as organizers on the ground, who ride transit, talk in community, live in community as well, we recognize these trends. Why is that? It's because we've had a displacement of people of color. So when you see the ochre, yellow, dots in the middle, that's where there's been a loss of demographics of people of color, and where you see the bigger and dark blue bubbles, that's where there's been an increase or a gain in those populations. So there's been an active displacement from the inner core of the city to the outer edge. Why is this important? Because the patterns of gentrification and displacement have actually effectively moved those who are lower income, who are people of color, outside of where we have the densest transportation networks and the densest transportation options. When you are downtown, you have a whole plethora of transportation options. You can take a scooter now, you can take bike share, you can take the light rail max, you can take the bus. If you're living out in Rockwood, your options are fairly limited.
Thanks, Libby. So this is where we hand off. We collaborated with scholars here at PSU and Opal to develop a mixed methods approach to our research questions, combining qualitative methods with quantitative methods. And as Vivian mentioned, we use our qualitative discussions early on in the study to hone in on what kind of language we needed and what kind of survey methods we would use to get a larger sample survey. So we started with two focus groups during the summer of 2017. One with a group of bus riders through the bus rider organization, Bus Riders United, which is also kind of managed by Opal, and another group of low-income East Portlanders through the Latino Network. Both were administered entirely in Spanish with English translation for English-only speakers, and really successful, rich conversations. And that led us to design our larger sample survey, which was also administered in East Portland. We had in the end about, I think it's 308 surveys, went through the fall. There was both an online and in-person effort to get those surveys. About half were online, half in person. And in the end, it represents fairly well the demographics of East Portland, as I'll show in the next few slides. I can actually grab. Oh.
I don't know if it works.
So the red was our study area that we had as a goal. And the darker shaded zip codes are those where we actually received surveys from. Because of the online survey, it was hard to control who got the survey. But interestingly, because of the social networks that we used to get the survey out, it was actually fairly similar to the demographics of the study area in red, as I'll show now. So for measures, for example, of income, our survey sample was slightly lower income. Yes. Our survey sample was slightly lower income than the study area. The study area, as I'll refer to, is the red area. This is the study area. Our goal, but we didn't exactly hit the goal, but slightly lower income, slightly higher poverty rate. But our age distribution was slightly younger. The gray bars are the survey sample, the yellow are the study area. We had a slightly younger group respond to our survey than live in the area. But our racial and ethnic breakdown was fairly close with the gray in this slide is the study area, the red is the survey sample. Slightly more diverse in our survey sample in terms of non-Hispanic white. So we had a slight overrepresentation of African American respondents, slight underrepresentation of Hispanic. But overall, we were fairly close in non-Hispanic white and people of color. So our methodology was basically analyze our focus group discussions and then look closely at our survey responses and break them down, compare them between the groups that we were concerned about and the other groups. So we ended up doing a comparison between non-Hispanic white and the remainder of the respondents of color, low income and high income. And then we actually did an analysis by age, but I won't be presenting that today in the interest of time. And then do the responses differ? Which of those differences are interesting from an equity standpoint? And we tested everything statistically. So differences that I mentioned are tested for significance. And where I say there's no difference, it meant that there could have been a small difference, but they were not statistically significant. Just a little bit of breakdown of our sample. As I mentioned, we were fairly evenly split for non-Hispanic white and people of color. So that's how the sample fell slightly, about half and half. And income, the cutoff was 50,000 household income. It's about 70% of area median income. And that was also about half of our sample was low income, a little bit more than that. So some of the results, and there's a lot of numbers here. I try to highlight some of the punchlines so we can get to more of a discussion. But there's a lot of numbers, so just bear with me. There are more numbers in the report if you want to download it from the track website that we're not presenting here. So some basic transportation access. How do you own a car? Do you have a driver's license? Things like that. Actually, driver's license comes up in a couple slides. But so I'm going to mention an overall rate for our full sample, and then I will mention whether there were significant differences by income or race and ethnicity, making those comparisons. And I've highlighted some of the issues that may bring up equity issues in red. So interestingly, in our overall sample, 30% of the respondents had no vehicle in the overall sample. So they're already very multimodal, but the higher income group had more access to vehicles. So they, not surprisingly, relied more on private vehicle for their travel. The higher income group in our sample also had more access to things like employer-provided transit passes, employer-provided free parking, on-site bicycle parking. So they were receiving more transportation benefits, but also had more access to private vehicles. So here's a punchline, more access to support for their commuting. And again, these questions were about their commutes, so I just wanted to clarify. Some commuting behavior. Higher income drove alone more, but the overall rate for our whole sample, which is quite amazing, was actually only about a quarter drove alone to work. Very low. The rest were doing public transport, actually about a third, and then a whole group were walking and cycling. Interestingly, about 2.3% of our sample was using Uber and Lyft to get to work, but about twice as many as that average of our low-income group were using Uber and Lyft to get to work. And that is probably related to issues of public transit quality and then some issues around timing and schedule, but also the lack of car ownership and needing fast, high-performance modes on occasion to get to work.
And also based on, remember our displacement map earlier, people need to travel longer. So even though we see here is a lot more people using multimodal transportation to get around, it's higher for low-income people and people of color, likely because their commute distances have to be much longer now because of that displacement. That's something to unpack.
So that was the main equity issue here, was this interesting greater reliance, although not overwhelming, 4.1%, but still much higher versus 0% for the higher income group. They do not rely, according to the 308 in our sample, on ride sourcing to get to work. So low income, punchline here, is much more multimodal. So they're more often using carpool, transit, and walk. And they are more dependent on ride sourcing for commuting. Paying for transit, lower income were much more likely to use on board. We interpreted this as cash, paying on board. As well, our respondents of color were also more reliant on cash on board to pay for transit. Higher income had more school or work-sponsored transit passes, and were more likely to use the online or phone apps to pay for transit. Similarly, with non-Hispanic whites in our sample, were more likely to use online or phone apps. So this is problematic. Less use of online and phone apps, more reliance on cash is again a barrier to moving to some of these smart mobility systems that really rely on those systems. So some more other barriers to access, some documentation issues, data, and banking. So this is just our questions on access to data and internet. Across the board, we asked, how frequently do you use email and internet? Do you have access at home, your workplace? Do you own a smartphone? How often do you rely on public Wi-Fi to reduce your data use? And then, do you ever have to cancel or limit your cell use because of a limit on your data plan? And these kind of get to this access to data and the ability to use, if you're out in a pinch, can you actually use your phone to get onto transit? And if you run out of data or you can't access that, you're in trouble. Well, overall, I think we see a very high from our overall sample access to data and internet. Like 88% using email at home, more than 90% have access to internet at home. 80% or so have access at work. Almost 90% have smartphones. How often do you use public Wi-Fi? A good share did say that they relied on public Wi-Fi to reduce their data use. And only about a quarter of our overall sample said that they had to cancel cell or limit cell data because of limits. But when we look at disparities by income and race, our higher income folks had better access to data and internet at home and work, and used it more through email or internet access. Similarly with our non-Hispanic white sample. Interestingly, our respondents of color had slightly more smartphone ownership than our white respondents, but not significantly from a numerical point of view, but it was significantly statistically, 91 versus 89. But our lower income respondents did have issues about data access and data limitations and reliance on public Wi-Fi to overcome data limitations, 72 versus 63%. Similarly, canceling or limiting cell phone use because of data limitations was significantly more for our lower income respondents and our respondents of color. So our Punchlines, overall data access is very high for our group, but there are significant disparities. Access to banking and credit, overall, fairly high access to credit cards, prepaid card accounts, and savings and checking. But when we asked about a qualitative response, a Likert style question about comfort with linking data and banking to some of these apps, there were disparities that are interesting. So our higher income had more access to credit and checking and savings account. Our non-Hispanic whites similarly than others. Pretty significant differences. For example, savings or credit here, you have 90 versus 60% access, and that's a pretty substantial difference. Similarly with differences by race. Comfort, there were mild differences here, but they were statistically significant. Higher income were more comfortable linking their private banking data to the apps versus low income, and similarly with whites versus our respondents of color on a 5-point scale. Driver's licensing, there's a pretty big disparity, partly because Oregon voters have limited access to undocumented folks to driver's licenses by state law. And that is evident through some of these disparities. So there are clear banking and credit access disparities that will be important to overcome. We also asked some qualitative questions around their familiarity and comfort with some of these new technologies. Again, this is not the most scientific question because a lot of them aren't necessarily aware of what these are or how it will affect their lives. We were just curious about the familiarity with it. And so we asked things like, are you familiar with electric cars? Are you interested in owning an electric car and autonomous vehicles? Similarly, how comfortable would you be riding in an autonomous vehicle? But we didn't really explain heavily. We had a short paragraph, but
We had a photo too for,
Yeah,
I think we had the
more
Google
detail.
car for the autonomous vehicle.
so this is very preliminary. But interestingly, our higher income and our white respondents were more comfortable and more familiar with these technologies. Finally, we asked them, well, which smart mobility applications which already exist are you using? Because there are some that are already heavily in use. And interestingly, we did find that, let me just quickly go over. So we asked, are you using public transit information on your phone apps? Are you using routing information? Are you using phones to reserve ride sourcing like Uber and Lyft, or bike sharing? And this is the rate of number of days per month that they are doing these things. Our overall sample was fairly low for using, for example, public transit was 13 times per month, days per month using public transit. For navigation was slightly more, but using it for ride sourcing, as we said before, was only 2% of all trips was ride sourcing. And then bike sharing was fairly low. But our respondents of color and our lower income respondents did use these applications slightly more than our other respondents. And that we found interesting. And again, this is probably due to lower auto ownership and more multimodal behavior. So finally, we had these intense focus group conversations. We gleaned some information that we really couldn't from our larger sample surveys. We just kind of summarized some of those here. Language was a big frustration. A lot of these applications, smartphone applications, are not translated into other languages. And so that came up a lot. Some of the signage that Vivian mentioned, so the real-time transit information boards and things are not often translated. Some of them are. And then trust and privacy and data security came up a lot. We had quotes like this: I do have a bank account, but I'm afraid TriMet will sell it or it will get compromised. I don't have any information on my phone. I'm afraid people will hack my phone. Let me just point out that identity theft can be devastating for low-income folks. A lot of planners are middle class. We don't understand. We call our bank, cancel a card, and in a week we're fine. But that doesn't always happen if you're not aware of how these systems work, and it can cause you much more harm if you're low income. And we've heard that a lot through our focus groups and discussions, that I think planners need to appreciate a bit more than they are.
I'll also, just to add on to that and flesh it out a little bit more, our respondents, we as Opal went and sourced the respondents and trusted our social networks. And so there's already a level of trust, especially for these focus groups. These aren't folks that we're just meeting for the first time. We're a trusted institution, so they felt much more comfortable speaking pretty freely, including, for example, admitting that they were still driving without documentation for driver's licenses, right? They were saying, well, I don't have it, but I still drive because I have to. So they were a little bit more willing to share their honest assessment of how they felt around trust. And remember, the survey was done in 2017. There's some technologies that were not available yet, so scooters hadn't arrived. I think that that's something we should look out for because some of that data is pretty interesting, especially in East Portland. And you know, immigration was a very, very strong theme with our respondents overall. A lot of this mistrust with the systems, any sort of systems, banking, my information, all was overlaid under this because of my immigration status and or people that I know and trust, or I feel that my community is being targeted right now. So that's just an overlay that I don't expect has gone away at all in 2018.
So we asked both through the focus groups and in the larger sample survey, what would folks recommend? We kind of had a list, but they could add other thoughts. These were the top recommendations, kind of combining our qualitative and quantitative data. The number one was to actually improve some of the transit apps. So they wanted to know things like crowding and the space on board for wheelchairs or shopping carts or other things that they might have that they often get left on the side of the road if the bus is too full. So
strollers are a big issue.
Right.
Big issue.
So that was an issue, so improving some of the real-time communication. And that is certainly doable, and I think part of the suite of upcoming smart mobility applications. The next most popular one, very close to the first though, was public Wi-Fi. And this came up also in the study on bike sharing, that the need for free access to data through public Wi-Fi stations could alleviate some of the anxiety around being out and about. And a lot of these apps, especially any apps with maps, are quite data intensive. And there are technologies now that only load maps on Wi-Fi, and they kind of use different ways of reducing data use. But still, that was an anxiety, so it was very popular. Can we have more public Wi-Fi stations around where folks would be accessing their bus stops, other locations? Number three, so part of our survey that I didn't dwell on too much was around electric vehicles. And they were interested in ways that could help lower income households afford or lease electric vehicles. And that was something that was mentioned. Finally, the language issue was quite popular, more translation of the apps into other languages. And then there was an interest in using autonomous technologies to develop lower cost neighborhood shuttles that they know TriMet can't provide now because of the costs. But with microtransit and autonomous vehicles running shuttle loops in neighborhoods in the future, this was mentioned a lot as a promising application of smart mobility technology.
And at least for our second focus group, we held that in the Rockwood office of Latino Network. And so this was before TriMet actually did the ribbon cutting on their 162nd bus line. So at the time we did this survey, we were doing it when there was over 100 blocks of no north-south service in the TriMet service area. So this idea became very popular because folks were really relying on making what we call horseshoe trips on light rail and bus together, in which you're going all the way to a transfer point and then going north and then looping back around because of the lack of north-south service. So this idea of microtransit, I just need to get to the community center or the health clinic or to visit my family or place of work. That's just right there. I'm taking all this travel time in order to get there. So this idea was very, very popular.
So overall punchlines. Smart mobility technologies, as they facilitate multimodal behavior, would appear to be very promising to support the already multimodal behaviors we see in the communities that we're concerned about. They're designed to facilitate multimodal behavior, so more investments faster can probably only be better for the communities we're concerned about. But there are issues. So while our respondents of color were more likely to own a smartphone, and they were more regular users of currently available smart mobility technologies, there were significant data and credit and banking access issues, which is our third major point. Significant barriers exist, which prevent these smart mobility technologies from benefiting all communities. On and underbanked, as we mentioned, heavy reliance on cash, limited access to data and internet, both at home, work, and on phones through data plan limitations and language and translation issues. That's kind of our punchline. We do definitely thank all of our survey respondents and focus group participants and are open to your questions.
So it seems like the payment side is a major barrier to any access to anything outside of transit.
Outside of transit?
Well, because you can use cash on transit.
Yes.
Currently.
Right, currently, you can currently use cash on transit.
Yeah, we're not even bringing up the movement across the country on the part of transit agencies to move to cashless,
Yes,
which is an entire.
And we actually,
Right.
So we're not
delayed TriMet's plans for that through our
Well,
advocacy.
right. And I guess what I'm wondering about is like, okay, so the only current smart mobility option with which you can use cash is transit presently. And so all these other modes are completely walled off if you don't have access to.
So there are
this sort of-
workarounds.
Well, I guess, just to get my question, I'm just like, so I guess my question is around HOP, because I understand HOP is a system designed to be able to work with the unbanked, that you can get a card and then you can take it to a Fred Meyer or something and load it with cash.
Sure.
And I'm just kidding, and I just noticed there was no recommendations around anything like that on that slide. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so thanks for asking that question. And there are, Bike Share has also an opportunity, especially for those who qualify, to continue paying in cash. The reason why there wasn't as much of a recommendation to prop up that sort of system is because that is an extra step. To go to a retailer, and there's usually a franchise agreement with that retailer, they're hoping that when you are at the convenience store topping up your card, you're going to buy a candy bar. You're going to spend more money there. That's also taking more time, right? So we don't want to necessarily incentivize and say that's the best way to do it. We want to actually preserve cash as a valid form of tender, a valid form of payment, for transportation, especially for low-income people. So this is something that Bus Riders Unite had as a point of advocacy as the HOP fare card was being rolled out. And there was a suggestion of the elimination completely of cash and also single tickets. We want to be able to preserve the ability to use those because for low-income people, it's an additional economic inefficiency to have to go to another place to utilize cash and load it onto a card and then access your transit stop, especially if those places are disparate. And the initial rollout of the HOP fare card suggestions of where you could go to top off cash, you'd have to go out of your way, the direction that you were heading to go top it off, and then get where you're going. That's an expectation somehow for low-income people and not for higher-income people.
Yeah, and those workarounds, I mean, there are two principal ones. There's the going to retail, and then there's things like Pay Near Me, which are more universal than cloud pantry. So, and then there's, of course, prepaid cards. So you could get a prepaid card, and a lot of systems accept prepaid cards. The issue is how do you get to the store if you're a transit attendant and you don't have any fare?
Yeah.
And you're going to go take a bus to get fare? It doesn't quite work.
Yeah.
So this is a big dilemma. It is nationally in a big conversation among transit agencies around going cashless and that transition.
Well, and I'm wondering also because the other modes, the scooters and the autonomous vehicles, they would be cashless. And I'm curious about something like HOP that can be a bridge, once that can accept unbanked take turn cash turn is something that you could use with something like a scooter. Is there anything that's under
I
research?
think that's not, so we didn't go, that was kind of maybe the next step in this, is really to get into some of the actual policies. We didn't get there.
I will say, you know, as someone who, I live in a blended family that also resides internationally in China, and I think it's worth looking internationally at what the trends are and what's happening there, especially, I know the Chinese market has almost gone completely cashless in urban centers. Everything is being done off smartphones and the social media platform of WeChat. It's interesting what happens when there is a sort of data blackout or Wi-Fi outage when you're at the grocery store, and that's like the one time the people who are paying with cash get the upper hand.
Yeah, I think in 10, 20 years, a lot of these systems will be integrated. So a single app with a single account may start a scooter and open a bike share and get you on the bus and pay for parking and.
The technology's there, we're just behind, quite frankly.
And some places have that already.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Some questions?
I'm curious, in part as an extension of that last question, but in general, just as something that emerged on some of the data that you showed, of those people who are getting employer transit benefits, how many of them are public employees? And then outside of that, did you guys check for just that basic transfer benefits? I'm on food stamps, I'm on TANF, and that affords me some level of, less passive transit, something necessity.
Yeah, it's a good point. So we didn't ask the question as you asked, so we don't know what kind of employee they are. But even a lot of private employees get some of these universal passes, U-passes, the kind of free transit. But one thing you just pointed out is actually how the low-income fare will work on TriNet is actually through kind of joining with some of the other benefits they're getting through SNAP and other programs. So that's a program that we're not going to go into here, but it is actually being rolled out right now and funded partly through the new statewide transportation bill and from advocacy from local was to get a low-income fare that is connected to those other benefits. So the low-income fare is about a 70% discount off the monthly pass for low-income folks who qualify through their membership in those other benefit programs.
Yeah, I believe Portland State here at the transportation services, and I see Clint back here.
Yeah, so we've signed up, as of right now, TriNet does not have a verification site downtown, which we are trying to rectify by establishing our office as a verification site so that it would be open to the public. Anybody who was downtown could come in and verify their income. As of right now, TriNet has been in our office for the last 2 weeks. We've signed up about 1,000 people on the low-income fares in the last 2 weeks. So there's still an additional step, unfortunately. The verification part is one of it. The second is that they have to visit the TriNet office in Pioneer Square to pick up the off hour, which is why we stepped in to try and act as that verification site that was nearby.
Yeah, I think you are the closest one right now to the TriNet's offices at Pioneer Square, so that's a big help.
Yeah.
And then the pass is good. The pass is good for extended periods of time, right?
2 years is what the verification is good for. So once somebody enrolls, their hop card is valid for 2 years. So that's a huge step. But still, we've seen this simple act of getting verified within the office hours of those verification sites to be by far the most restrictive part of the program.
Additional questions? Additional questions? I'd love to have a woman ask a question. Yeah.
So I'm asking a question from one of our online audiences. They were wondering, you guys mentioned the hesitation that a lot of low-income users have in trying to use their smartphones to pay for transit services for fears of compromising their bank information. Do you have any particular recommendations that would address that particular issue that you can see from your research?
My recommendation is this is an overarching fear and climate of fear that, we've created for people who are mixed documentation. I know there was an article recently talking about Bank of America even freezing accounts of people who had ethnic sounding names. So this is a culture of fear that we perpetuated until we address this overall cultural issue. I don't know if we have very specific ones that relate just to transportation mobility, honestly.
I mean, there are workarounds like having a low balance on your phone in case there are issues, or trying to firewall it from your other accounts. Some people, if you're wealthy, you create another bank account that you use, or a prepaid account that you link that is
Preserving cash?
Yeah. If anyone else has any other ideas. I'm not a coder, there's probably some coding issues. Yeah, here and then.
I was wondering, it's very clear to me to see how the trust issue is linked to immigration issues. I just wondering if there's something I was unaware of besides, like I think Latino communities in particular have a lot of reason to have trust issues with banks, but I honestly don't know, like, there's gotta be more reasons than, I mean, I hope there isn't, but I'm just wondering if you guys have seen other things that give way to mistrust.
It's just, you know, the data breaches, Facebook trolls, hacks. There's an overall awareness that that there's less and less ownership over personal data once we go online and once we put our information into systems that someone else owns. I think that's a very clear narrative, and that was reflected in our focus groups.
And distrust within communities of color historically, distrust of banking institutions is high. This is not a new thing. This is just a current trend in a long.
It's a heightened awareness at this time.
But there's also the spatial dimension. I mean, your phone locates you. And if there are things like ice sweeps or other things, you don't want to have your location if there's somehow, heaven forbid, some kind of warrant out for you because of an ice sweep, and they have your location information.
And there's a little bit of a
linking your phone to some of these things could be problematic for many.
This wasn't talked about in this particular presentation, but folks did cite that they needed greater education and familiarity with apps and with their smartphones. A lot of our focus group respondents said, I'm familiar with the apps that I use, but I still use my phone for 3 functions: to send a message, to take a phone call, and to take a photo. And so they said that I would be open to learning more about how to utilize this device and utilize these apps, but I want to be able to learn that through a group educational setting like this focus group that we're having. Can we learn together about this?
Yeah.
I have a question about transportation network companies or ride-hailing services. I was really surprised to see the result that 4.1% of low-income respondents use ride-hailing apps like Uber or Lyft to get to or from work. And I was wondering if you had any more information, either from the survey or the focus groups, about which trips those are people using it to get to and from work, or is it when I'm going to work really early in the morning, when I'm coming back from work? Is it about connected to transit? Is it about security? Maybe I don't want to walk long ways in the dark.
It was kind of all of that. There was a lot of discussion in the focus groups about safety at night, missing connections, a bus end, some routes end at 8 or 9 o'clock. Not very few, but some do. And if you're further out, it's more likely that your service is quite limited.
So there's this video, actually a documentary that an Opal organizer did a number of years ago for the benefit of our campaign for a fair transfer to extend the transfer times, but it's of Adela. And Adela is an SEIU service worker and cleans, even now, hotel rooms and office buildings downtown here in Portland, including the Standard. And Adela used to live at 14th and Hawthorne, and due to the patterns of gentrification and displacement, she now lives in Gresham. And the documentary shows what time she has to wake up to work and actually walk to when the closest bus, the end of the line, when it starts running in the morning. And she shares a short anecdote around a really frightening interaction that she had. So it really highlights the personal safety, around gender safety, being a woman in public and dark, language barriers as well. and what time the shifts for low-income people and those workers, especially service workers, what time those shifts start, and then the mismatch with our transportation network. So it's called Adela's Journey. It's on Opal's website. You can find it on YouTube as well.
And there was a mentioning of, I think, I remember one conversation in the focus group about bringing family members. And in fact, in an Uber trip, it's one fare, whereas on the bus, you have multiple fares. And that was one issue that was brought up. It wasn't overwhelmingly common, but it was one. Yeah.
You'll proceed doing additional focus groups on this same conversation topics?
We don't have any plans to. I think definitely moving to more of the specifics of implementation, working more with the city on the Smart Cities plan, kind of interpreting some of these results for their implementation is our next step. I think the research, in a way, is.
Yeah, Verde is undergoing a mobility needs assessment that's really discrete to the Cully neighborhood and really focusing in on Hacienda. There was also a pilot project for a shared electric vehicle at the Hacienda apartments at Killingsworth. And so that's focusing on a number of issues, but again, towards the end of advocacy and recommendations around infrastructure needs and other sort of partnerships. So Verde is working on that right now.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned a need for public Wi-Fi and charging stations. Is that something that is happening? Do those already exist?
Yeah, someone in the room may know more about this, but there are these new kiosks coming.
Yeah, certain cities have begun implementing them. They're typically done with an advertising partner, which is not, I think there are some valid critiques of that. But New York City is probably the largest network that I know of in the United States. It's something I've heard rumblings about here in the city. I don't know how close we are to seeing anything on the ground, but pretty easy solution.
So. And it's part of the Smart Mobility plan. If you read the plan, there's a link on the PowerPoint. So just check that out. They kind of define where they could be, but John may know more.
Well, the city has put a hold on doing any kiosks. There's been some questions about the functionality and the cost of doing widespread through kiosks and the use. But we will be testing a thing called the Prep Hub, and it will be based at PSU, and it's a idea of a nodal place for emergencies that people can go to if there is, like we have these beacons. But that will have public,
like a tsunami or
earthquake would be probably what we hit here. So that's a big wave. But it will have public Wi-Fi. But the intent is to have a gathering place that people use normally, that in case of emergency that they would know where those places are so that they can go to. And that will be a public Wi-Fi node. It'll be based on campus, and it's the first of a test with this idea of this prep hub.
I'm glad that you mentioned that because, I'd be remiss if I didn't just highlight the intersections of disaster preparedness and really climate justice issues that really underlie a lot of the research that we did and the solutions that come up. I think it's really important. People need to be able to know how to get real-time information. And if we're relying very, very heavily on certain technologies and expecting people to have that, then we're going to be in trouble.
So yes.
Couple things. Thanks so much. It was so interesting listening to everything. I loved the recommendations. I always notice, traveling, that everybody's so much more inclusive of languages and just trying to help people get where they need to go. So I look forward to the plan and how to integrate more languages in like the real time and on the buses and everything. The Smart Cities plan, you said you're done with the kind of the knowledge part, now you're gonna put it in an actual plan and then sort of integrate it. Do you have like a timeline?
Well, the city is running their smart mobilities planning, and so we were in conversation with them quite a lot. It's a long-term project. They have kind of pilot elements of the project that they're rolling out slowly. So there's emission sensors on Powell. There's like different aspects of a lot of the different areas are already kind of being rolled out. but it is a multi-decade process. It was different actors, TriMet, PBOT,
So then, like, not
others.
necessarily like the 2035 comp plan where it's like actually like it written out something is kind of.
I would recommend looking at the link to the plan as it is in that website. I have a screenshot of it on the PowerPoint. Because it's pretty cool. There are a lot of different things going on.
We have time for one more question.
Maybe one more question.
It sounds to me like advocating kind of against a cashless system for the time being is probably a good thing for, where sharing information. I'm wondering if you guys have any recommendations for the public to take part in that.
You can definitely get involved with groups who are organizing transit-dependent riders. So Opal Environmental Justice Oregon does organize Bus Riders Unite, and there's monthly membership meetings. And we're always actually looking for research support, quite frankly. It wasn't sort of for the personal and professional relationship that Professor Golub and I have, and his investment in actually Opal and our organization by being on our board of directors. This may not have been possible. So we're always looking to partner with individuals, students, folks who have access to this sort of research and can help us even frame some of the questions to help support our advocacy. As a community-based organization, groups don't do research kind of for its own sake. We must connect it to advocacy, but we also need that research to support a lot of times the things that we're asking for. So.
Maybe one more question, I guess. Yeah.
Back related to the cashless system and related to HOP, I agree that the HOP is looking convenient because you do have to go to these retailers that many times off the way of your transit mode, whatever it may be, or your route may be. But at the same time, is there a way to, along with maintaining that and also providing better access to HOP, maybe at the stations or the buses if you actually take, is there a way to use the benefits of HOP? Because if you think about it, HOP provides benefits that as a low income person you very appreciate of. For example, you load it twice or you get a day pass, or you pay cash, is you paying. It's not something you just hear. You see often in many places. Not from DC, and they're the same system. You have a cashless system, but people prefer to pay cash, and you always end up paying more.
Yeah.
Maybe education or other measures to be implemented.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's exactly why those users must be critically integrated and have meaningful involvement in these systems to ensure that we're not locking ourselves into a system that isn't flexible and that we can do broader education around it. That would be, that was absolutely why we underwent the advocacy of saying, hey, did you consider these points, right, about like locations of your retailers? Because you're absolutely right. There are benefits directly to not even low-income people. I mean, if you don't want to spend $10 a day on transit through cash, right, when a day pass is just $5 for an adult fare, that benefits us all, right? So there are benefits to it. The advocacy point is meaningful engagement and involvement of those who will be most directly impacted to help design the systems, because then we have something that could be more flexible.
And that's why the low-income fare is so important, to your point. They'll be, as soon as they're riding, they'll be hit the monthly pass or the day pass much sooner.
We have to income qualify, and that's 200% of the federal poverty level. We know that there's a lot of people who are just barely over that, who still need to receive those benefits, right? So the HOP pass absolutely is something that that does give that benefit.
Thanks so much.